writing together. And one of the books that I mentioned yesterday when I was talking about where you could go get great bibliographies and see different examples of different kinds of narrative research and communication is the book that she edited in 2005 called Narratives, Health, and Healing. And so that is an edited collection with different contributions, but she has an initial essay in there where she kind of lays out her view of narrative in health comm. And really, it reiterates a lot of ideas that we've touched on in here, but she comes at it in a little different way, so I thought I would just go through this quickly this morning. She calls it narrative problematics. The problematics being making explicit assumptions in the process of analyzing narratives, bringing the background issues into the foreground. And she does it through a series of dialectics. I thought I had put in a different slide where I got rid of that parenthetical comment almost, because I really think she does state her ideas in terms of dialectics. I don't know, I used this in class one time and I don't know why I put almost on there. So she says that the narrative turn in communication research is a manifestation of postmodernism, and I don't know if you study postmodernism here, but some of the signs or indicators of postmodernism is that, you know, there's not an answer. There is a multidimensional, multifaceted answer, and the texts that we deal with, and just think about the film that we started with this week, that these aren't straightforward texts. You know, if you study public speaking, there's a speech that's well thought out, it's directed to an audience, it has a beginning, middle, and end. Those aren't the texts that we're dealing with. So we're dealing with messy, unruly kind of text. That's Rita Sharon's word, unruly, which I think is a good descriptor. That we juxtapose multiple, sometimes competing identities, plots, scripts, so that one text doesn't exist in isolation, but it's in a context with many other kinds of texts or narratives. No one authorial voice, but many, and we have to choose among those. So the first problematic, and again, these problematics are, the way Harder states them is in sort of a dialectic of two different ends of a spectrum and the tension between them. So the first one is the dialectic between knowing and being. So narrative expresses the tension between our inner thoughts and feelings and our outer social behaviors. And we're constantly mediating between that. So as we've said in here before, narrative is a process of identity construction. We are simultaneously telling our stories, but at the same time we're living our stories. And so the story is dynamic and it keeps on going even as we try and put boundaries around it and tell it as a story. And she notes that telling stories is a relational process because we're telling our story to someone. Living our story is our own kind of self-experience. Narrative as a dialogue or a dialogic process, and we've said this several times already this week, stories involve co-construction between and among participants, audiences, researchers. The second problematic that she talks about is the tension between continuity and disruption. So, you know, we talk about the need for creating a story because of a rupture, some kind of disruptive happening in our life that we have to make sense of, and then that sense making is a search for coherence. So that tension between rupture and coherence is ongoing. And we've talked some about implotment. So when there is some kind of pivotal experience, a rupture that makes us rethink the plot that we're telling about, that we're living, we have to think about what happens to our self-identity, what happens to the plot that we think that we're on a path toward, and then, oh, we have to rethink that plot and re-implot ourselves. And again, Mattingly's question of figuring out what story am I in. I thought I was living one story and oops, something happened and now I'm living another story. This tension between disruption and continuity also causes us to have to think out, if we're re-plotting ourselves, what are the new boundaries in terms of time, place, space. And when life gets messy, not only texts are unruly, but definitely life is unruly, then we have to search for coherence in terms of not only what plot am I in, but what voice am I speaking from, and how can I assert agency or some sense of control when life is seeming very unruly and maybe out of my control. So that kind of tension. And she adds that then because of our need for coherency, we have difficulty with hearing chaos stories. And chaos stories comes from Frank. And so she's making a reference to Arthur Frank, who we'll be talking about tomorrow, and his classification of stories of restitution, chaos, and quest. The third problematic is the tension between creativity and constraint. And so there's the urge or predisposition for personal creativity, particularly in story making, but we have to do it within the boundaries of cultural norms, values, sometimes even rules about what can be said and not said. Certain things may be taboo or considered inappropriate. So there are, and this is exactly what tonight's homework assignment, or today's homework assignment is, refers to master narratives. Master narratives are, and we've touched on that during our discussions. They're kind of pervasive cultural stories that were taught or socialized in probably from the time we're very young. And most people in the culture, you mention something and people know what the story behind that is. So on the worksheet that I prepared for today, I mentioned, because I know it came up when we were watching Amour, the cultural narrative of aging that a lot of people ascribe to, and it was mentioned as we were talking about the plot of Amour, that aging denotes kind of a downhill slope, that, you know, people are deteriorating as they age, that there is a need for dependence, much as there is in childhood and old age, there may be more need for dependence upon other people, that life kind of closes in and isn't as full. That's a widely ascribed cultural narrative or master narrative. And the Harder says these are stories embodying beliefs, values, hopes, fears. And so those cultural or master narratives help us navigate. They serve a function because they inform the general society. And you refer to something and a lot of people know what you mean. So in that way they can be enabling, but they're also constraining. If we want to think in terms of variant or alternate narratives, not everybody will know what you're talking about or will agree with what you're talking about. And so the master narratives afford people a legitimization. So, and Frank talks somewhat about this in that first chapter that I assigned when he's talking about what does it mean in society to be sick. And he talks about Parsons, who was a sociologist, his notion of the sick role. And it doesn't exactly, Frank points out, well, that's a master narrative, but actually everybody sees through it a little and it doesn't really work, but it's very pervasive. So that if you're sick, Parsons says you have kind of certain permission in the general culture to bow out of things for a while. You can be excused from work or family responsibilities, maybe for a while. And then the expectation is you get better and you come back in. So that's kind of a master narrative for illness, but then Frank, pokes his finger through some of that and says, but that doesn't really work. Not everybody gets better and comes back in. And even when you're sick, does that really mean you're excused from all your responsibilities? Not really. Mothers get sick all the time. That doesn't mean they're not there taking care of their kids, or professors get sick, but they still come in and do their lectures, and unless their temperature goes to 37 point. So, but it does legitimize you. If you can say you're really sick, you're legitimized for taking a break from certain things. You're also, there's a constraint with it. You're supposed to take care of it, to see a healer or a doctor and take medication and try and get better, not just to keep on being sick, and certainly not come in and infect other people. So one of the chapters in Lynn's narratives, Health and Healing, was written by one of her co-editors, Phyllis Japp, and Phyllis has chronic, it's Japp and Japp. I think she wrote it with her sister, and I don't know which one, but one of those authors has chronic fatigue syndrome. And that's kind of in the, borderlands of, is this a legitimate illness or isn't it? And so she's writing about the cultural narrative of what it means to be legitimately ill, and that requires kind of a firm diagnosis and really recognizable symptoms. But when you have something that's kind of on the border lines, like chronic fatigue, where some doctors believe in that, some don't, there isn't really a medication that deals with it, it takes you out of your normal routine, because not only are you fatigued. I think there's a whole battery of other symptoms that go with it, but it's kind of one of these iffy kinds of things, and it's also an invisible illness. Somebody might have chronic fatigue, but you know, they're not in a wheelchair usually. You can't actually see it. And another example of that would be the story that I started with in the Sharp and Vanderford piece with Rose, who had this muscle weakness. And you remember she got in she ran a red light, and the officer that stopped her accused her of being under the influence of substance because her eyes looked kind of heavy. She wasn't able to walk a straight line because she had this generalized muscle thing, and that wasn't a legitimate reason in the eyes of the police officer that stopped her. So our master narratives that explain certain things give legitimization, and when you don't fall under the purview of those kinds of master narratives, then like Rose or like the person with chronic fatigue, you feel silenced, you feel ignored, you feel delegitimized, because people really, they don't have an explanatory narrative that helps them understand your situation. And then there are deliberate counter narratives that are a form of resistance against master narratives, that people are deliberately trying to articulate an alternative view because the master narrative may be unfair. So with aging, there may be a lot of people above whatever age you want to draw a line in the sand, who say that that's not the way I'm going. I'm not going downhill. I'm perfectly active. I don't have to depend on a lot of other people, or not more than normal people depend on other people, and I have a whole second or third career that I'm going to embark on, and that master narrative of aging doesn't fit me. And I think, at least in the US, I don't know how it is in Singapore, there's a whole generation of people that were the baby boom generation, who have reached the age of retirement, who are like, I'm not going that way of the master narrative. I have other things in mind for me. So that would be a deliberate counter-narrative. Welcome. Okay, and the fourth problematic then is the tension between the partial, well, maybe this is why I said almost dialectic. This isn't really a dialectic, but she calls it the partial and the indeterminate. That refers to how a story is framed. Thank you, Daniel. What do we include in a story and what do we exclude? And this is something we've touched upon also. Like, what's omitted and why, and who's doing the omitting. And she says that this also refers to lived stories as ongoing, what I'm calling dynamic, subject to revision, always incomplete. And we just have to accept that about lived stories, because it's our life and our life goes on. And so there's never total closure. So she says this narrative scholarship results in as many questions as it does answers. And I think that's a different a realization about scholarship. Usually we come to the end of a study and we expect to see conclusions and generalize from those conclusions. And so ending a piece of scholarship with, I mean, you do want to reach some realizations and insights. That's the purpose of scholarship, but and also to raise questions is part of the deal too. And finally, she mentions, and this has to do with the indeterminate, what's the boundaries of a story when other stories that relate to it coexist? And so we refer to this as intertextuality, that at the same time a story is put out there, it's side by side with other conversations, other stories that impact the meaning of the story that you or someone else has put out. It doesn't exist in isolation, in other words. Kenneth Burke a long time ago referred to the ongoing conversation of life, and he kind of describes walking into a living room where there are all these conversations going on. And that's kind of the same idea, that every time we launch a new story, it goes out there in, you know, in the, whether it's in virtual reality or face-to-face reality, where there are already other conversations going on that will have some bearing on that new story. So that one, I think that's why I put a question about dialectic, because that one isn't a dialectic, it's just a description. But it's kind of a nice way of summarizing a lot of the issues about narrative, many of which we've talked about. So, that was one thing I wanted to talk about before we showed the video today. There's a couple other things. I wanted to say something about Arthur Frank, who I assigned some of those chapters today because there's 4 chapters to read, and I wanted you to get a start on that. And I'll talk more about Arthur Frank the next time, and we'll talk about what his project is, what he's doing. But just so you have some introduction to him, Frank is a sociologist, but I think his work is different than a lot of other sociology. I think he started as just a regular sociologist. I don't even know what his area of study was. I do know that he has a master's degree in communication, so he's informed by that as well. But what happened to him, and he writes about it in his first, it's a very small book, but it's a good book, called At the Will of the Body. The Will of the Body. And so he was in his early 40s, he was like 41 or 42. He was a runner, he lives in Canada, outside kind of guy, very fit. And he was running, and he started having chest symptoms, and at age 42, he had a big heart attack. And that took him out of commission for a while, and he had to try and make sense of that, being this fit, running kind of guy, and having a heart attack at age 42. And that got him started on the path of thinking about illness stories, because everything that we just talked about, he experienced and had to go through. What plot am I in? What is my identity now? I'm not who I thought I was. So that's what he writes about, and that's partly what he writes about in At the Will of the Body. But a heart attack is something you can come back from, so he's out for a while, he deals with it. He's not quite the same person as he was before, but he's pretty able to come back and resume an active life and be a professor and all of that. And then, I think something like a year later, pretty soon after the heart attack, he's hit again, and this time he's diagnosed with cancer. I think he had, can't remember, I think he had testicular cancer. And this really knocks him for a loop. This is not something he can come back from in the course of a year. And so that's the meaning of the title, At the Will of the Body. It's not his will of who he thinks he is or wants to be. His body has something else to say about it. And he writes about that illness experience in that book. And this puts him on a whole nother track for the scholarship that he does. And he becomes very interested in illness stories, both that he hears from other people, and he does a lot of reading in published autobiographies and biographies of people who are writing their illness stories, and literature that speaks to that. And so he makes a whole lot of references as you read his chapters, and they're not quite as, in my mind, as esoteric as some of the literary references that Rita Sharon gave. These are illness narratives that there's some really good ones in there that he references. And he's really interested in the impact of life-threatening or at least life-altering kinds of stories. So, for example, he refers to this woman, Nancy Mayers, who writes about her experiences as an academic and also as a mother, somebody with multiple sclerosis, and how that changes her life and takes that out of her. So in his second book, and he's written several books since then, but I think this is the one he's most known for, and this is the book from which I assign chapters. It's called The Wounded Storyteller. And in there, he's read or hears all these illness narratives, and he's trying to make sense of it, and so he organizes them into what he calls a typology of narratives. And I suggested to Pauline and maybe some other people that this, not necessarily about illness narratives, but about whatever it is you're working from, this is one kind of way of organizing narrative scholarship. So it's not just the content of what he's writing about, but the way he's doing it that I thought would be good for you to see. Because if you're doing something with, I don't know, Daniel, how many interviews are you doing in your project? 20. But Mohan would like you to do 30. Anyhow, you start getting a lot of interview data or focus group data or whatever it is you're doing, and it becomes, it may become hard to manage. And so what he's saying is each story maintains its own integrity, but there are certain characteristics that through which you can organize the type of story it is. And so that's what I want you to see in Frank, is how he formulates a narrative typology, because I think that could be a useful scholarly technique for you. So I just wanted to give you some guidance as you're reading the Frank chapters. And I mentioned his typology that he comes up with because it caught on a lot. It becomes quite famous and lots of narrative scholars make reference to it. So he comes up with these 3 story types, and that's what we'll discuss tomorrow, of chaos stories, restitution, and quest. But I'm also mentioning it because Bonnie Creel, whose work we're going to discuss today, also makes reference to those story types as well, and she uses them in her work, so we're kind of previewing Frank's work today. Let's see, it seemed like there was something else I wanted to talk about this morning. I'm blanking on what it is. Well, maybe it's just the whole notion of performance. We do have to talk about that. So, in the Reisman book, she organizes that book by different kinds of, because she's interested in methods, different kinds of ways of doing narrative analysis. And she says there's thematic narrative analysis, in which you're picking out themes within the content of the narratives. And remember, I said she makes a distinction, though, of keeping it narrative rather than doing grounded theory, because she's still respecting and keeping the integrity of the story together. So it's themes within a story or a certain kind of story. She also uses kind of typologies also when she's doing her interviews with women who have been women in India who are infertile and what happens with them. She also talks about structural analysis, and this is one that isn't used by a whole lot of communication people, but there are some examples of that. So people that do discourse analysis and conversational analysis are doing forms of structural analysis. They're looking kind of at the grammar of the story, the form of the story, and also people who are doing rhetorical analysis of stories and say, using someone like Kenneth Burke. Kenneth Burke has something he calls the pentad. A pentatic analysis would also be a structural analysis. So thematic analysis in the foreground is content. Structural analysis in the foreground is form. And then she has 2 other chapters, and I think the content and the form are, kind of basic. But then she wants to bring in other ways in which we need to consider narrative. And so she has a chapter on performance and a chapter on visual narrative. And we're going to delve a little bit in this workshop into both of those. So performance, obviously if we watch a movie like Amour, we're watching a performance of a story. If we go to the theater and see a play, we're watching a performance. That's one way of thinking of performance. Ethnographers bring the notion of performance into everyday life. So the way we do things in life is a sort of performance as well, and that's kind of like a Goffman-esque version of performance, presentation of self in everyday life, and whatever rituals we use, whatever kind of symbol systems we use are forms of performance that go on all the time. So that's another way of thinking about what constitutes performance. What I'm going to assert today, and what we're going to see an example of, is performance as a way of doing scholarship. And let me step back from that for a second and give you come at it in a little different way. A person, I don't know, if we would have had more time for this workshop, there would be many more scholars that I would obviously include. One of those is a woman by the name of Laura Ellingson. And Laura's work is everything she writes is fabulous in my book. She's a really good scholar. But one of the contributions she's made is she introduces a notion that she calls crystallization. And she has a book about crystallization. Is this something you'd read in your classes here? Is anybody familiar with that? Okay, so what Laura's notion of crystallization is, and it really applies to any kind of qualitative research, of which narrative is one. And it came out of her own work. When she wrote her dissertation, she decided somewhere along the way that she was going to take the data that she collected and look at it from as many different vantage points as she could. So there's a book that she published that is really her dissertation that she worked on a little more, and it's called Communicating in the Clinic. So what she studied for her dissertation was, it was a geriatric oncology clinic. And at first she was going to study the provider-patient communication, and then, forget why, but she made a change and she decided she really wanted to get, that was kind of the front, in Goffman terms, that was the front stage of that operation, but she wanted to get to the backstage. And so what she studied was the teamwork among the various professionals, the nurses, the radiation people, the oncology doctors, all the people that work to make this clinic work. And she did it ethnographically, and she went every day for a year and spent time collecting field notes and stuff. So she amassed a big amount of data. And for her dissertation, and then it became this book, Communicating in the Clinic, she introduces what the context of the clinic is. And then she has a variety of chapters, and each chapter looks at that database from a different vantage point of analysis. So there is a pretty straightforward grounded theory analysis that is thematically based. There is a narrative analysis that views this as an ongoing story. And just as kind of a footnote, but it's a footnote that explains something in the book, Laura herself has had cancer, and she had a sarcoma, which is a bone cancer. And at the time she wrote the book, she was dealing with the aftermath of the sarcoma, and she walked with, she had trouble with her hip, and she walked with a pronounced limp. She had a lot of trouble with the aftermath of the cancer. Since the publication of that book, the cancer came back and she had to have her leg amputated. So one of the things that Laura is very aware of and has made the rest of us aware of is for the researcher themselves, and I just touched on this briefly in another session, that our work is embodied work. And so for her, it was really prominent. So all the hours that she spent doing observation in the clinic, she had, her hip ached, she had to get off her feet for a while. Her, kind of like Frank's notion at the will of the body, she couldn't ignore her body, it was in there. So during the time she was doing the research, I think this isn't when she had the amputation, that happened later, but she started to have more problems with the sarcoma again. So at the same time, she was going to this hospital to observe the clinic. She also had to be a patient that was seen in the same hospital. So there were times when she was going there as a researcher and times when she had to go to another clinic, put on one of those paper gowns that flap open in the back, and sometimes she might even run into her research participants while she herself was a patient in another context. So another one of her chapters in the book is an autoethnographic chapter. Are you familiar with the term autoethnography? Where yourself is what you're investigating? So she has a grounded theory chapter, she has a narrative chapter, she has an autoethnographic chapter about these two parts of her life intersecting during the time she's doing the research. And then I think the fourth analysis chapter is she uses feminist critical theory because there's also some gender issues in this clinic, and she wants to look at those in power and gender. So the content of Laura's book is very interesting about team collaboration and conflict in healthcare. And I usually, if I teach a health comm seminar, I use her book for that purpose. But I also recommend her book for many, many of my students in terms of a model of doing research, because she incorporates all these methods. So her second book that she came out with talks about this approach to methodology, and it's called Crystallization. I don't have the whole title, but it's got crystallization as the first word. Crystallization in qualitative research or qualitative communication research, something like that. Look up Ellingson on Amazon. And so from what she learned from her own experience of using these things, she creates a way of thinking about doing qualitative research. And crystallization refers to the metaphor of a crystal with many facets in it, and that we're looking at our subject matter or our data not just through one lens, but from all the reflections from all the facets of the crystal. And it gets to what Lynn Harder is talking about many meanings and indeterminate meanings, and not just one answer, but many approaches to understanding whatever phenomena you're dealing with. And so I give that to my students so that they can see that they don't have to emulate Ellingson. In fact, I think it would be hard to do as much as she did, but she's really inspiring. People come away very inspired by her notion of crystallization. And in this book, she explains what she means by crystallization, and what she is doing is, or suggesting that people do, is something that is more typically within the realm of social science, and probably the prime exemplar of that would be to do a grounded theory analysis. I mean, that's probably the most popular kind of straightforward kind of analysis that people do in qualitative research, but it's not the only one. So grounded theory, we immerse ourselves in the data itself, and we come up with formulations from that. But you can also, of course, do theory-driven research, and I think a lot of that goes on here because a lot of you are using the CCA to do your research. So it's not grounded theory, it's theory-driven theory, or you could use Foucault or Kenneth Burke or whoever's existing theory helps to shape your research questions and your method of inquiry. So she says you pair one of those with something from the more artistic realm. And she brings in things like visual analysis, performative analysis, poetry. And to meet her ideas of crystallization, you would use at least two of those methods and bring them together, and maybe more. So I really admire her work, and I recommend it to you highly. So Bonnie Creel, whose work we're looking at today, was one of my PhD students. I turned her on to Laura Ellingson, and she became very inspired by that, and she decided to use crystallization as an approach in her dissertation work. Bonnie is a person of my own age. She came to graduate school really kind of late in her career, and she had a master's degree. She taught in a community college, but she decided she really wanted to do a PhD. And it took her 10 years, but she wrote a great dissertation. And she wasn't sure when she came to graduate school what she was going to do. She's a person who, her master's degree is in communication, but she has always loved theater and dance and the arts, and is very inspired by that and incorporated that in her teaching of her students. So she was fishing around for what she was going to do for her dissertation, and during the time she was doing that, she took a year off from the community college to come to Texas A&M full-time. And the reason it took her 10 years was then she went back to her regular teaching. She taught 4 to 5 classes a semester, and had to finish her coursework and write her dissertation during that time. So I'm very proud of her for finishing, and she wrote a great dissertation. But during the year that she was off on sabbatical and came to spend it at Texas A&M and take classwork for her dissertation, I forget how this even happened, but she went to have a gynecological exam. She might have been having some kind of symptoms. I can't remember exactly. She hadn't, women are supposed to have an annual gynecological exam. You're supposed to go every year. After a certain age, you're supposed to have a mammogram, and you have a pelvic examination. And they check for cervical cancer. And is that the same in Singapore? Is that recommended yearly? Some places it's biannual, but It's either biannual or annual. Bonnie hadn't been to have an exam like that in years and years. And the reason she didn't is that she is an overweight woman. She's an attractive woman, but she's overweight. And she had very bad experiences when she went to the medical care system that you'll hear about. She was made to feel very badly about herself, and she is not the only overweight woman who has had this experience, so she avoided doctors. So she finally goes and has this gynae exam, and her pap smear comes back abnormal, and she started freaking out. And it turned out it was okay. She didn't have cancer, but for a while she thought maybe she did, and she started blaming herself because she hadn't been to the doctor in such a long time. So this kind of set her on a course for what her dissertation research would be, and she decided to interview other women who had been labeled overweight or obese, and find out their experiences with interfacing with the healthcare system. And the results of that is what she wrote up for her dissertation, and I don't know if you had time to look at her chapter last night, but what I gave you was her straightaway grounded theory analysis, thematically based on what she found. She also did, like Laura Ellingson, she did an autoethnographic chapter, and she did a narrative chapter. She did those 3 chapters in a crystallized way, looking at her same set of data. But then she decided to add yet one more aspect of analysis. And the rest of her committee, like, fortunately for her, I was her advisor, because I was definitely a proponent of this and I knew she could carry it off. The rest of the committee was like, let's just get this dissertation done, that's enough, blah, blah, blah. Good dissertation is a done dissertation, which is true. But she really wanted to do this other part. And so what she did was a performative analysis of the same data. And that's why I kind of wanted you to see what does a grounded theory kind of thing look like, and what did she do with it in performance. So she came to another narrative seminar that I taught, and she did the whole performance and we videotaped it. So that's what I want to show you today. It runs about 90 minutes. So, and what I want you to be aware of as you look at this is the question of what you think of this as a scholarly approach. Do you think it's a scholarly approach? And what kind of insights do you think a performative analysis results in that maybe you wouldn't, that are different from reading this as a grounded theory analysis? So why don't we take no more than a 5-minute break, and we'll come back and I'll put the DVD on right away.
Her form of presentation.
And that was?
Her form of presentation,
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, so it's kind of like, embodying the stories that she was studying.
Does it belong in academia?
I think it does. It's the complete antithesis of what, the empirical positive side, where you you know, especially the way you present the data, it's so objectified, and you take your subword term and you write in third person, and you say the data says this, or my study says that, and this is the complete opposite where you're actually physically there, presenting the work, and being accountable for it. It's like there's no, it's much more than just saying, oh, I'm writing in first person, I did this, I did that. I am actually there. I am actually presenting the work. So I think it's like the complete opposite.
It's definitely the complete opposite. What difference does that make for the research, do you think?
I think there's something, I think it belongs in academia. However, I also see, I can already tell a lot of pushback would happen, you know, in academia based on, I could just see like the written versus the visual, or the written versus the performative, and I don't know, maybe I need to think about it a little bit longer. I already can see in my mind a lot of controversy coming up about including this as a, I don't know, as a equal part of, you know, a written journal article or something. And not because I think it's any less valuable or that that represents my view. I just can see that that might be a controversial space.
But the thing is, like, you know, she presents her data so well. She you know, personifies. She embodies it, right? It's like she actually lets her data speak for itself. So in that way, isn't it nuances and more than you can get written, right, from her voice? I mean, right now, her pathos, everything, she captured every. Like she took such great field notes. You can't get thicker than that.
Mm-hmm.
But that said, I'm sure it's a recontextualization. I'm sure it's her interpretations
Exactly.
too.
It actually points, though, when she performs it, and then when there are like slips where you yourself as the audience slip out of the suspension of disbelief when she starts talking about like, oh, you know, I have curly hair and then but clearly she doesn't, or she talks about Mexican and she doesn't come across as Mexican. That's when you come to realize that I wrote this down when she was speaking, that it was actually a performance of a performance. She's re-performing what her interviewees tell them, and then at the same time realize that that's a performance of a performance because the interviewees are retelling what they experienced. So it's a third level performance. And then she was recounting how one of the interviews was recounting one of the stories in the support group, you know, hiding the pecan pie in the tin under. So it's a story of a story. So it's another level of performance. So when you think about when it comes to the part where she presents to you, how many levels of recontextualization and meanings just to get to this point where we actually get to see the story. So I think that adds a whole extra level by pointing that out and making you really aware of it.
And are you saying that was a strain? You said that it was hard to suspend your disbelief at that point.
It's not that it was a strain, but it makes you aware that she's not the person, she's telling someone else's story.
Yeah.
And makes you think of that's not really their story as well, because it's something that happened before.
Has the vagina monologues been performed on this campus?
Yes.
Actually, that was one of the inspirations for how she went about this. We went to see the vagina monologues, and I think that gave her ideas about how she was going to do her work.
I was doing PR for the Arts House, and we had a localization
I think I
of
saw that.
Did you see that? East
Probably.
Ansler vagina monologues. Yeah.
I have a question for you, or for anyone. I think especially pertinent to us in Singapore, with a lot of different cultural groups, or even not just cultures, but I wonder if this would be any different if she weren't overweight. Like if she was very slim, doing this research and performing these stories, like would that change it for us, or is that, you know, is that space still there? I don't know.
I would think it would have to be different, but then I don't think she would have been moved to do this research either.
Right, right.
I don't know that it would have occurred to her to do that if she wasn't who she is.
Yeah. I guess I'm thinking like for us, like.
Oh, that you're going to a very different kind of group to collect your
Right,
data.
but it's still very, I see a lot of parallels in the performativity of a lot of the stories, and it's different because we don't relate necessarily on the same level as she does, so inherently is very different, but I just wonder.
Well, you know, I cut it off before I guess they videotaped the whole class conversation that followed from that. There were a lot of men in the group. They came from different cultural groups. There were a lot of African American men, and I wondered what they were going to think or how they related to hearing that. But people in the class were really moved by it, and it wasn't their story, but they could see their mother's story or their sister's story in there, and on that basis it was very moving for them.
Yeah. I guess I just wonder, as someone who's getting the stories or collecting the stories as a cultural outsider, or as someone who is not sharing that core motivation for the story with that person, how that changes your representation of.
I would think it would have
And
to.
like, how do you
But
negotiate
it
that?
doesn't mean that you don't, I mean, you just related a different level. It didn't happen to you, but
Mhm.
doesn't mean that you're not empathic or moved by it. But, yeah, it would be different, I would think.
Actually, when I'm watching it, I was using another thing. I was thinking another way of presenting this one, because I think this is the voice of the researchers to interpret what the interviewee's voice, right?
Right.
But how about if I do it like a more like I take the video of all the interviewees voice, like I have the extract of it, and then put it in the video, because it's their voice, but I do the editing, and then will it be more natural and more impactful, because you can see the face. Of course, it's with the consent of the interviewee. If they agree to appear in the video, will it be more impactful because it's their own voice? And I don't know whether it's.
What do people think?
I think.
I'm thinking that this one, in presenting that, and then especially by performing that, I'm thinking of how the medium, like in a sense of ghost medium, and then reincarnation. So basically, that kind of spirit comes and then get performed, and then that kind of medium, like just juxtaposed with like media study, the mediation, things like that, and then versus a critical scholar or a scholar of, do not use performativity, but instead to say that, this is the quote, and here I'm going to analyze this. So this kind of facing in as another person presenting or performing, or facing out as myself analyzing it, but then still the same kind of persona. I think it's really fascinating because it shows interwoven kind of narration. To me, I think it's really fascinating. But as for it is, whether it is scholarship, I would say it is, but then there's another layer of that. So my question is, from not being considered as scholarship to being considered as scholarship, especially in terms of publication, maybe you can tell me
Yeah, well,
some kind
let's
of
say if we go,
struggles there.
well, if we go back to Ellingson, her, and the whole notion of crystallization, her feeling is that, and she says there's two kinds of crystallization, and I'm blanking on the name that she gives one, but it's like within one piece of work, you do all these different things, or from one project, you can spin off a lot of different byproducts, and that one she calls dendritic. I do remember that, and it comes from, I don't know what the root of the word is, but it's like a tree with many branches.
That's what they call the nerves, the branches of the nerves that connect to each other. They
Oh,
call it
the dendritic, yeah.
Dendrites,
So that's her metaphor for that. And what she's saying is you can reach a lot more audiences with your research. So you do your grounded theory or your critical analysis or your theoretically based, and you use that for your publications, but you take your performance or your video or, you know, or your documentary, and you can reach audiences that most academics never do. You can reach the policymakers, you can reach the women, the obese women who don't know that so many other people have experienced what they have experienced. That your scholarship can be much better disseminated if you have many forms of doing it. Because honestly, most people, now I don't need to be a downer here, but I mean, you could be Arthur Frank and have a whole lot of people have read your book, but for most people, you put that journal article out and you can probably count on your hands and toes maybe how many people have really sat down and read it. How many people are you really reaching? I mean, that's a bit of an exaggeration, but not a lot. So, you know, it's very esoteric, this academic publishing enterprise, and so, you know, the relatively small group of people who are really interested in what you're interested in and will read that specialized journal is pretty finite. And there's so many more people that we could potentially reach.
This might be sidetracking a little bit, but there are all these new kinds of scholarship, for example, performativity, and also using cartoons or photo essays with not many words. So, what is there, like, is there an institutional struggle or a period where, you know, it's on the verge that, you know, some scholar would say that this is not scholarship at all?
Well, I mean, Sarah's right, there's pushback, there are people that, so I had Lynn Harder come to A&M, and in addition, she is very productive, writes many books and articles, she does the straightaway scholarly thing. But the other thing she's doing is making documentary films. And so she had done work at MD Anderson Cancer Center in Houston with childhood cancer, and I was trying to figure out a way to include her film in this workshop. We just didn't have enough time for all the different things I could have done. so she did a film. She had come to Houston to screen it at the hospital. So then she was including the hospital people in her group of, and the parents of the children, and the children themselves, those that had survived, some hadn't survived. And so she was reaching a lot of people. So Houston is an hour and a half away from where I live, so I invited her to A&M to show her film in our communication department. And we put out, you know, notices with her picture and her bio and what this was going to be about. And I mean, I think there were people that were in awe that she had made a documentary film, and there were people that were moved by it. And then there were also people that had an attitude about, not a good attitude, like, that's all very well, but that's not scholarship. And some of the graduate students who were not in health comm, but from other areas, and we had told them what it was going to be about. It moved people, even if they didn't want it to move. And some people had tears running down their face, and then they got like kind of huffy about it and went to the department head and complained that, you know, that they were taken by surprise, that maybe they didn't want to expose themselves to something so sad. And my my attitude was like, well, welcome to health comm. This is what we study, you know, and it's just like you study some things in OrCom or in rhetoric. This is what we study, and it's about human lives. And yes, it is moving. And yes, we gave you some warnings, so if you had tears coming down your face, that's probably a good thing in my book. But yeah, not everybody is going to be agreeable to that. And yes, with the new forms of scholarship, the ones Laura Ellingson is pushing, yeah, not everybody's going to get with that. But okay, so we're almost at an end, but let me ask the question, what was your response to this? I know it was a little long, but what was your response to this? Do you feel like you maybe learned something from her research that you didn't learn from like reading a grounded theory analysis? Was there something to be gained from it?
I think as a student of narrative inquiry, you not only learn, like I think it will stick with me about the actual struggle of obese women, but also the methodological choices that she made and the way she presented. So what she chose and how to organize the narratives and the categories she chose or used from who was it, the restitution inquest from Frank. And so I felt like you did get to see an example perform to you of the methodology that you wouldn't necessarily take away. I don't think I would from reading it, whereas I could see it in action the way that was presented.
Which was my reason for bringing it here.
Mm.
But I think with photo voice, with a performance like this, with Lynn's documentary film, I personally, I do think that there are insights that we wouldn't necessarily get from reading the written report of it. We could read the quotes and stuff, but I don't think it would have the same impact. But also, even though she was representing all her 23 women, I think it is a way of giving voice to people that don't have voice, which is what Photo Voice is about. And I think the same thing is true here. We don't know what, she documented over and over how people are disgusted by people that are overweight. so they're not likely to share those stories because they know how other people are responding to that. So we're hearing kind of a slice of life that we wouldn't get to hear because those are not people out front telling their stories. And just by the by, as I've been here in Singapore, I mean, everybody looks, most people look very slim and small, and I'm 5'4.5", 5'5", and I feel like I tower over a lot of people here, and I know I couldn't go shopping and find my size in most of the stores here. But my husband, who works in public health, had a visit with the dean of the School of Public Health here on Monday, and one of the things that came up is that increasingly the problem of overweight is escalating a lot in Singapore, which that surprised me because I don't see it around me, but it's an issue even in this locale. So yeah, I think there's that emancipatory kind of thing where people that you wouldn't ordinarily get to hear their story, or even insights about health, that some of these women were really overweight, but their cholesterol was okay, and their blood pressure was okay, and they weren't diabetic, and all the other things that we would assume was wrong with them isn't. So it's a different kind of learning. It's not for everybody, but I think just keeping the option open of alternative forms of sharing your research is worth something. What you suggested, Pauline, the only problem, I mean, I think that that's doable. I don't know how many of those 23 women would have been willing to be on camera, number one. Number two, then there's the question of the IRB, which you could probably get it through, but I bet it would be quite a task getting it through the IRB.
I think also for using video, you kind of take a step backwards in a way, because you're at least attempting to hide the fact that it's a represented story, that you've cobbled it together. And maybe only when you reach the end you put editor and you put your name there, but before that it doesn't seem as evident. It's kind of like Amor, when we were talking about who's the protagonist.
Yeah.
And you don't know
Whose
view
viewpoint
is.
it is. Yeah.